The purpose of this lesson is to learn how to use the Visual Studio IDE to create forms applications. So we're going to start using some of the utilities built into the IDE to be able to make forms. We're going to be using the toolbox. We're going to learn what buttons are, what different forms are, how to use labels, text boxes, how to correct errors, and then also whether if you should make your application as a console-based application or a Windows Forms application. One of the questions that I hear frequently is, what is the difference between a console application and a Forms application? And the main difference is just simply how the program runs. Now, in this case, I'm using just our standard calculator. This is what's considered to be a Forms application. This is what you're used to seeing with regular Windows applications. You also have Forms applications for other platforms like Mac and also Linux, but in this case we're playing with Windows. So in our form we have different types of what are called controls. And so I have a control called a label, and a label is just simply a text field that will display text on the screen. It doesn't allow for input, it just simply displays it. I have what are called buttons, and now this is Windows 10. Windows 10 does use the buttons a little bit differently. What we're going to start playing with is going to look more like what you've seen in Windows 7 and older versions of Windows. Later in the semester we'll start playing with different types of form controls so you can actually customize these a little bit to make them look more like the modern apps. So anyhow, these are different buttons. Every one of these is a button, and they're just simply sitting here waiting for me to do something. These are what are called objects, and it's waiting for me to perform an event. And an event is going to be, if I click on one of these, then it will cause it to do something. This is our object-oriented programming language. So what happens is, in a console application, typically we're going to run from the beginning to the end of the program. Console application usually is just simply going to be to throw something together real quick that maybe we just need to perform a calculation. We don't necessarily need to build the whole form. And a console app will usually be faster to build because we don't have to design the form. The two different types, a console application and a Forms application, both require the same amount of coding, but a Forms application also requires for us to design the form and set all of the events for our form elements. Alright, so I have a form here with some controls on it. We have a button. So when I click on this button, I'm actually performing what's called an event. And this particular button will have an event that is going to actually occur. So in this case, it's an event that happens when I click on it, therefore it's called a click event. Alright, so I'm going to click this, and when I click it, it causes it behind the scenes to perform some code that is pertaining to this particular button. Now when I clicked the 2, it added it to a register to keep track of what value I actually clicked, and it updated the label up here to state what I actually put in there. Now there's actually another label up here that's not visible until you click an operation. So if I click plus, now I can do 3 plus 6 plus, and you'll notice I have another label up here that's keeping track of all the calculation that I'm creating, and this is keeping track of the answer. But the entire thing is a form that has controls that react to events. That's the basis for our Forms application. So we want to start making this type of application, and we're going to do this with the Visual Studio IDE. We use the Visual Studio IDE to make a console-based application, but now I want to make a Forms application. So I'm going to make a new project, and my new project this time I want to make sure that I'm on Visual C#. If you select Visual Basic, you'll get very frustrated because you'll design your entire form only to find out that it's not going to work because your code won't work. So make sure you have Visual C# selected. We're making a Windows-based application, and we want a Windows Forms application. Now, when we actually design our form, we need to name it. So what we're going to do is we're going to name it according to the scheme that is listed on Blackboard. So in this case, it's going to be my last name, underscore, and then this is week 4, and then underscore, and then this is going to be number 1, so N1. So what it's going to do is it's actually going to create a folder under the Documents Visual Studio 2012 Projects folder, and then we'll call this folder Pringle underscore W4 underscore N1. So we'll keep all of the elements that pertain to my project in that folder. this entire folder is what's called a solution. So I want to make sure it creates the directory. I'm going to click OK. In a couple of seconds, you'll notice that it will actually bring up a blank form. So here is our blank form. The form over on the right-hand side here, we have our Solution Explorer. Remember, the Solution Explorer just simply keeps track of all of the stuff that makes up our application. So in this case, I have a solution, and it's the name that I just gave to it. It does have a namespace, which is going to be our entire application, and you'll see this in another spot. It does have properties, we have references, and we also have our form is listed right here. And if you notice, this thing is called form1.cs. Now, what I want to do is I want to start using standard naming conventions. One of the things that you'll see when you run applications that people make and just put on the internet for you to download and use, a lot of times they'll just be thrown together, they're kind of sloppy, and one of the things that you'll see is that you'll have a program that's called Form1. And all this is just the friendly name that shows up at the top. So our form, I want to start adding some properties to this, or editing some properties to make it look a little more professional. Before we do this, I want to show you over here we have the toolbox, and the toolbox contains common controls. By default, yours may only show some controls, and if it does, what you do is you scroll to the bottom, and you'll notice that these are actually listed in separate categories. And so you have common controls are here, and these are the ones that you will commonly use, but they don't include all of them. So if you scroll to the top, you will see one that says All Windows Forms. And what this does is it shows you all of the controls that are available to you. They are in alphabetical order, makes it real easy to find them. And all I have to do to actually use one of them is just simply double click on it. So what I want to do is I'm going to build an application that will take two numbers and it will display the output on the screen to give the answer. So what I'm going to do is I want to have a couple of elements on the screen, and the first thing that I'm going to use is what's called a text box. So I'm scrolling down to text box, and I can either double click on it and it will put it at the top left corner of what's called the parent container object, which in this case the parent container is the entire window. If I double click on it, it just puts it up here. I can move it around, do whatever I want with it. Or the other option is I can take my text box, if I get the right one, and take it over here. Now what you'll notice is as I'm dragging it around, I get these little handles that show up above it. And what it does is it will snap in line with the other text box that's already there. So if I decide I want to move it around, those blue lines that show up are actually telling us that, hey, those two are lined up. And then if I bring it up enough, that's a predefined space between the two boxes. So if you notice I'm moving my mouse, I'm still holding it, but it will snap to that distance away. And the point of that is that I can put my text boxes on the form and it will automatically align them in such a way that they're spaced far enough apart that we get this nice little space between them. But then if I put another one on the page, it can just very easily make them all a nice and uniform distance apart. So if I were to throw a third one in here, I bring it in, drop it, and if you notice, if I move it around, it is lined up to the other two, and it also will snap to these other ones. Okay, so I really don't want this one. To get rid of it, I just simply click on it. On my keyboard, I'm going to press delete, and it's gone. Alright, so the question is, what are these boxes? Now, when we made our console applications, we would actually prompt the user. What is your name? What is your telephone number? How many blenders do you want, or something like that. So what we need to do is the same kind of thing that we did in a console application. We need to specify here. So we need to tell the user, what are you trying to get? Alright, so what I want to do is I want to put something here that will actually tell the user what they're supposed to be doing. And what I am going to use for this is what's called a label. Alright, so I have label 1. Now when I first drag it in, it will snap it to the bottom of this box, but I don't necessarily want to do that. The reason I don't want to do that is if I snap it to the bottom, it won't line up with the text inside of it. So I'm going to drop it on my form, and then when I let go, I can click it again and drag it, and I want to drag it up just a little bit, and you see that little pink line that shows up? That little pink line means that it will line up with the text inside of the text box. This is where I want it lined up. Okay, so I'm going to take another label, bring it over. Same thing, notice it snaps to the bottom of the box or the top of the box, but I can't snap it to the text. So I let it go, then I move it, and I get it lined up the way that I want it to be. And if you notice, I have the pink line, so it shows that it lines up with the text in the text box, and then I have the blue lines that show that it lines up with label 1. Every one of these applications that you design needs to be designed professionally, it needs to be laid out, and it needs to look nice. So make sure that you're paying attention to how you lay things out. All right, so what I want to do is I want to tell the user, hey, type in a number here, type in another number here, and I want a button down here that says calculate. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a button in the middle of my form, and notice it automatically lines up to that button there. So I want to stick it in the middle, so we're going to put it somewhere in the middle for right now. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to make it when they type in something here and they type in something here, and I push this button here, that it will actually put something on the screen to tell them what the sum of those two numbers is. All right, so I'm not going to use a text box because a text box typically means to the user, type something here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to use another label. So I'm going to go down and get another label, drag it here in the bottom, and I'm going to put the label here. But actually what's going to happen is when we start off, we're going to hide this label. I don't want anybody to see that it's here to begin with. I only want them to see it when they actually perform the calculation. All right, so I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to move it over a little bit. And the reason for it is I want it to say the total of whatever the first number is and the second number is something or another. So if I were to leave it in the middle, what you would end up with is the text starting here at the left and then going off the side of the screen. So I'm just simply going to line it up here to begin with, and then we can move it around later. All right, so I have this form that has a whole bunch of extra space around it. So I'm just simply going to make the box a little bit, or the form a little bit smaller. And that's the basis for adding things to a form. So these are all the elements that I can add, or controls. All right, so I want it to do something, but before we make it do something, we need to make it look nice. All right, so the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this form. Now right now, the actual file is called form1. This is actually a file sitting under my documents, and it's called form1.cs. Well, the question is, what does form1 really stand for? So what I want to do is I want to get in the habit of renaming everything using standard naming conventions. Now the standard naming conventions are all listed on Blackboard, and I want to show those to you. Alright, so I am in Blackboard, I am under Learning Content, and if you scroll down through the list here, we have our commands for the compiler and to make our shortcut and so forth, and if you keep coming down, you have these naming conventions. And the first one is Common Control Naming Conventions. And then down below this, we have our variable naming conventions. So I want you to look at the common controls. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to rename my form. Well, to rename my form, I look through the list and I see, okay, here's form. So a form is going to have a prefix of FRM. And our first form is typically our main form, because remember, we always have a main method, and the main method just simply tells the program that's the entry point, that's where the program starts. So we typically want to have a main form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name my form FRM main with a capital M. All right, I have some buttons on my form, and if you notice, if I look at button, there's no button here. All right, so the reason for there's no button being listed, it's actually called a command button. And so our buttons are going to start with CMD. That's a command. We're going to tell it do something. So our button is going to be CMD something like calculate. So I'll have a CMD calculator, or CMD add, or something like that. All right, so I have labels. Well, labels keeps coming down here, and I have label, LBL. So I have labels. Now I only have to rename the labels that I'm actually going to manipulate programmatically. The labels that we're going to add to ask the user for the first number and the second number, those we don't necessarily need to rename. But the one where we are actually going to change the value to state the sum of 3 plus 5 is 8, that one I need to rename, because anything that I want to manipulate programmatically has to be renamed. Alright, so those are the three things that I have on my form. So I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio. I have a label here. Now this label, like I said, I'm not going to rename it because I really don't care about its name once the program runs. It's just simply there to display something to the user that says do something. Now if I wanted to change this later programmatically, then I would have to do something with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select it, and you'll notice that over here I have label 1 selected, and I have a drop down list here that shows all of the controls that are on our form. So I can actually select them from here, or I can click them on the screen and it will automatically change for me. And based on the type of control that I have, they will be listed here underneath for all of its properties. Now it's up to you. Right now by default it will be in what's called a categorized view. Personally, I prefer the alphabetical list. And the reason I do the alphabetical is it puts all of the controls simply in alphabetical order. All right, so every element that I have has a name. Now, this is where I'm going to call it something like LBL and then give it a name. And like I said, this one I really don't care. I'm not programmatically going to change it, so I'm going to leave it the way that it is. All right, so if I scroll down, it also should have a value for text. Now, this is what it's actually going to show on the form. All right, so I want it to say enter number 1. Okay, now when I press enter, you'll notice this changes over here. Now, it did just move this closer to the text box, so I want to line it up, make it look a little nicer, so I'm going to move it over a little bit. All right, so now that also means that I need to move this other one because these need to stay lined up. All right, so this top one, this bottom one, make sure that they're lined up. I get my 2 handles, and I want to rename the second one. Now notice text here is just label 2, so I'll say something like enter number 2. Press enter, and now that changes. All right, so what I want them to do is I want them to enter a number into the top box, enter a number into the bottom box. We're going to add the 2 numbers together, and we're going to display the output on the screen. So the question is, what kind of value am I going to put in here? And here's the catch. This thing is a text box. Note the name. It is a text box. It cannot take a number. It only takes text. Now, what we can do is we can take the text that's in the box and we can convert it to a number if it's something that looks like a number. But whatever the user actually types into the box really is text. So this box right here is going to simply be our text box for number 1. All right, so if I go back over to Blackboard, I will see that a text box is a TBX. So I'm going to change this to TBX, and I'm going to call it number 1. Press enter. Now, I'm not changing the initial value for it because I want the text to remain blank, but I could actually change the text and it would change the information inside of it. All right, so the other one is going to be TBX number 2. All right, so that's our text box number 2. Then we have a button down here, and our button we're going to call a CMD calculate. All right, so now we have CMD calculate, but it didn't change the text on it. That's actually going to be down here under text. Okay, so I'm going to type calculate, and that's our actual command. So typically what you'll see is whatever the value is for the text, it'll typically be CMD and then that same value. So in this case, the text on the screen says calculate, so I have a CMD calculate. All right, and then this label down here, we do programmatically want to change. But what I want to do with this is I'm going to call it LBL, and maybe I'll call it answer. That's going to be the label to hold our answer. All right, so press enter. It didn't change anything here, but you'll notice it did change the name of it here. Now, like I said before, I want this thing to not necessarily display anything on the screen until the user presses the calculate button. All right, so I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to change this text. I'm simply going to delete all the text and press enter. All right, so you'll see there's nothing in here. Okay, I want you to see something. Most people will lose it because what happens is if I click somewhere else, I can't click back on it. But remember I showed you over here? I can select it because the LBL answer is still here. And when I select it there, then it shows it on the form. So remember, you can select every control over here in the drop-down box, even if you can't get to it over here. All right, our form, I need to do a couple of things with the form. All right, the first thing is I'm going to change the text to be a descriptive name. So what do we want to call our program? So I'm going to call the program add numbers. So now that's the name of our program. This is what somebody will actually see. That's what will show up on the taskbar when the program runs. When they hover over it, they'll actually see add number. But I didn't actually rename the form. To do that, I'm going to rename it here. So it's FRM main. And there we go. All right, now that renamed the form itself, but that did not actually rename the file. I want to rename the file because what will happen is if I start making more and more of these forms, let's say I have a program that has multiple forms, I want it to be able to designate which one is which, so that way when I go and look through the directory structure and I see all these files sitting in the folder, I want to know which file is which. So what I want to do is I want to rename this. And to rename it, you're going to right click on it, go down to rename, you will get a box here popping up asking you what you want to call it. It's going to be FRM main. Press enter. And now what you'll notice is behind the scenes it just did a whole bunch of stuff. There is a lot of code behind the scenes that actually is dependent on the name of this form. So make sure you're aware that to rename this, you have to right click on it, rename it, and then it will do all of the background stuff for you. Renames all the other files. Everywhere it's referenced in the code throughout all the different files that are in the solution will automatically get updated for you. There are other ways to rename it, but if you don't right click on it and rename it, it will not automatically update the code for you. So you're probably thinking, all right, we just made a program. And the answer is no. What you just made is a form, and it took that long to make the form. This is why sometimes a console application is actually faster. Because what's going to happen is, now that we have the form designed, now we need to actually create all the code to go with it to make it actually do something. And the thing is that in our console application and our forms-based application, they both take the same amount of code. So what I'm going to end up with is the same amount of work designing the code plus the time that it took me to design the form, and sometimes I may just want to throw something together real quick to perform a calculation, and I don't necessarily need the form. So you need to decide if you really need the form or not, and if you don't, then chances are you're going to make a console application. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to start giving this thing some actions. I want to tell it what to do when somebody does something to it. Alright, so if I look at this, what I'm actually going to have happen is the user is going to click in this box here, then they're going to click in this box here, and then after they type a value into both of those, then they're going to click calculate. Calculate is actually the only button on the form that has an event, because when they click in here we don't do anything, when they click in here we don't do anything, but when they click on this button then we have to perform some calculations and then display the answer on the screen. So the only part of this form that actually will have an event is going to be the calculate button. To create the event for it, it's real easy. All you do is just simply double click on it. When I double click on it, it will take me to the form main.cs, and this is actually showing me the code view. This is our design view for the form. This is our code view. Now you can also get to this by right clicking on the form and then view code. It takes you back to the same place either way. Alright, so one thing that people will do, and they will do this accidentally, is somebody may actually come into here and accidentally double click on the form. And when you double click on the form, you'll notice that you have this form main_load. Now this is a method that will occur every time the form loads. Any text that's in here would automatically run. Alright, so I accidentally made it. I want to get rid of it. The catch is that I can't just delete this. If I delete it, my program will break, and I can't even get back into Visual Studio to fix it. So what you need to be aware of is the two choices are either to leave it here with just simply no code in it, which is actually considered to be bad form. It's a waste of space. It's just a bad design. Or you go back over the design view, and if you come across here, you will have a little lightning bolt. This is your events. And if I go to events, you'll notice that I have the form selected, and therefore the event for when it loads will perform the form main_load. To remove this event, I just simply delete it from here. So I highlight the text, press delete, and then press enter. And what that actually does behind the scenes is it actually just removes the code for that event. So if I had typed any code in there, that code would just be gone. Alright, so what you'll notice is our button, if I click on this and I go to the lightning bolt for events, it does have a click method. Each object, each control type has a default event. So the default event for a button is click. Default event for the form is load. Alright, so I could make it where if somebody clicks on a label that it does something by just simply double click on it, create an event for it. But I have all sorts of different events that I could actually choose. So let's say I don't want you to have to click on the button, maybe just simply highlight over it. Then what I could do is I can make it where when you get the mouse over top of this, it'll automatically run. Alright, I don't necessarily want to do that because users are going to get upset if your program automatically runs when they just simply hover over the button. Alright, so I want to get back to the properties view, and the way that I'm going to do that is to click this little icon right here to the left of the lightning bolt, and when I click it, now I'm back to the properties. Now, when I look at my form, I want to make it where the user comes in, and when they click in the first box, they can simply press the tab button. And when they press the tab button, it'll automatically go to the next text box. And when they press the tab button again, then it'll go to the calculate button. There's what's called a tab stop and a tab stop order. And what you're going to do is each element that you create on the page will automatically be assigned a tab stop. And the first element is tab stop 0. Next element will be tab stop 1. The next element is tab stop 2, and so forth. But I can actually control that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my text box, and if you come over here, you'll see this tab stop is true, which means that when they press the tab key, it'll just automatically go to it. Now, the very first element gets created as 0. If you remember, the first thing that I created was my text box. The first tabable thing was my text box. And so it's tab index of 0, and then this one is tab index of 1, and then this one is tab index of 4. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go 0, 1, and then 2, and I don't want for somebody to be able to tab to over to these elements here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this 0, make this 1, and make this 2, and so we're going to simply change this to 2, but the catch is I have another item over here that has a 2 also. So what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to move this up real high, so maybe make it like 1000. And then this one we're going to make it 1001, just simply to make it high enough that they're not necessarily going to be the same value as another element that I really do want to be number 1 and number 2 and number 3. Alright, so what will happen is when I run the program, it will allow me to get right into that first text box, and then I can tab through. Alright, so I don't actually have any code, but I can still run the program. I'm going to come up here to start. This will allow me to debug it. And I get the form. And if you notice, because my tab stop of 0 is in this first text box, my cursor just automatically is here. So what I want it to do is I want it to make it where when I type 3 and I press the tab key on my keyboard to go into the next text box. Alright, so then I press 5, press tab again, and it automatically goes to calculate. Now I can use the space bar to press the calculate button, or I can click on it. And what I want it to do is when I click calculate, I want it to display something down here. I don't have any code right now to actually make it do that. All I have is the form and an event for the click event for this that just simply doesn't do anything. Alright, and you notice our label down here isn't here because remember we set it as empty. There was no actual value to it. So it's actually not even going to show up because we just simply told it not to. Alright, so I want to add the code for this to make it where when I click on the calculate button that it'll actually do something. So what I'm going to do is I need to read in whatever the user typed in here, and we're going to put that into a variable. Now remember, like I said, a text box is a text string. Therefore, I have to have a string variable to hold the value for this. So I'm going to have a string variable to hold number 1. I'm going to have a string variable to hold number 2, and then I need to convert that value to a number. Now I want these to be, let's say, a double, so that way they can enter 3.2 and it will allow it to do it. Or in this one they can enter 3.6. Or if they even just simply enter 3, it'll automatically take it and put it as a double because I'm telling it the type. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it where they type text into here, put the text into a text string variable. Then we're going to convert that text string variable to a double and put it into a double variable. So what you'll see is I'm going to make a variable for a text string called str number 1, and then I will make a double called dbl number 1. And the dbl number 1 is the one that I can actually use to perform a calculation, just like the console application. Alright, so in this one I'm going to have a string variable called str number 2. Then I will convert it and put that into a double called dbl number 2. Then when we click calculate, we're just simply going to set the label's text property to the value of label 1 and label 2 added together. So I'm going to go back over here to the code, and we're going to go ahead and start adding some code in for this event. Now what you'll notice is all of my using commands are already listed here, including things that we'll use later in the semester. So we can do drawings, we can use link, we can do text, and so forth. But notice we have using system.windows.forms. So now what that does is that allows us to interact with things like our text boxes and labels and so forth without having to type out system.windows.forms.textbox.whatever else. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to declare some variables. And these variables are going to be to hold the text value for the number and for the number value for the number. So I'm going to say something like string str number 1, and I'm just simply not giving an initial value yet. Alright, I'm going to do the same thing for the string str number 2. Now you'll notice the green underline under str number 1, and that just simply means that I have created the variable, it's declared, but it's never used in the program. Now the program will actually compile, but this is considered to be bad code because I haven't actually used them. Alright, so then I need a double, and we'll call this dbl number 1, and then another double called dbl number 2. And then we're going to take the sum of those two numbers and we're going to stick it into another double value, and we'll call it dbl answer. Okay, so I'm going to say double dbl. Actually, let's call it dbl sum because that's what we're doing, is we're actually adding them together. Alright, so all I've done is just simply declare the variables. They're there, available for me to use. I'm allocating space in memory, and I can actually use these. Now, I need to modify the IDE just a little bit because I want to make it easier on myself to troubleshoot. If you notice, I have no line numbers over here. I need to turn those on, and on yours, you may not even have this pane down here, which is for the error list. So I'm going to come up here to the view, and what I can do is I can turn on the error list here. I can have my solution explorer. I can turn on all the other panes that we have available to us. So we have properties are listed here. So we actually do have the ability to turn things on and off as we want. But I need to turn on my line numbers, and to do that I went up here to the Tools menu, Options, and then on the left side I want to scroll down to Text Editor and expand it. And there's an entry here for all languages. And you could do this for each individual language, but it makes more sense to do it for all of them, and just simply turn on line numbers. Go ahead and click OK. And now I have line numbers that show up, which means if I get an error, I can actually go back and look at the line number just like I did in Notepad++. I can look at the line number, figure out how many characters across I am to where the error message is, and it makes it really easy to troubleshoot. Okay, so now what I've done is I've just simply declared the variables. Now I need to read some data in from those boxes, and then we're going to go ahead and convert that to another, to a number. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take whatever the contents of the text box number 1 is, we want to look at its text value and put that into our text string. So what I'm going to say is str number 1 is equal to whatever's in text box number 1. So tbx, and remember the nice thing with having the prefixes is it makes it real easy. I know I'm looking for a text box, therefore it's tbx, and it'll show me in the IntelliSense all of the text boxes that are available. So tbx number 1, but I can't just simply set a text string equal to the text box because they're not the same. I can set my text string equal to whatever is in the text box's text value. To do that, I'm going to put a dot, and then now I have all of the functions that are available for that text box. Alright, so if I scroll down through the list here, I can actually go down and look and see all of the things that are available for it. And if I scroll way down, keep going down, you actually see we have a text value. And the text value is the same thing as if I were in the designer and I come down here and I look at text. Because the text here, if I were to enter 3.2, it would show up in the box here. So if the user is going to enter 3.2, at that given point in time, the text value for that box is 3.2. So that means that this is the value I'm looking for. So what I want to do is I'm going to come over here and I want to set the string number 1 equal to the text box number 1 dot and then text value. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with my other one. I'm going to say str number 2 is equal to tbx dot, I did dot by accident, tbx number 2 dot and the text value. And IntelliSense, as long as I didn't move away from this area, IntelliSense will automatically complete it for me. Okay, so the next thing is I need to convert those values. So I'm going to simply say read values from text boxes and put into string values. Okay, I'm sorry, not values, string variables. Okay, so I have those into string variables, and now I want to convert the string variables to doubles. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take dbl number 1 and set it equal to, and we're going to convert the value of our text box. Now I can either do a parse or I can do a convert. So I'm just simply going to do a convert dot to, and now if you look, I have all of my 2's available, so I know what versions I have available. Now I have a 2 double, and what am I converting? I'm converting str number 1. Okay, so now I have whatever's str number 1, convert it to a double and stick it into dbl number 1. Do the same thing with dbl number 2. We're going to set that equal to convert dot to double, and then whatever in str number 2. Okay, so now we just simply converted them. Okay, so then the next thing we want to do is we want to add the 2 numbers together. And if you get in the habit of breaking your program down into little pieces like this, it'll make it easier for you to troubleshoot. So I'm just simply putting comments to list what this little section of code does. Now, I could have actually declared my variables right here. So I could have typed string str number 1 equals this, string str number 2 equals this, and then double dbl number 1 equals this, and double dbl number 2 equals this. But I'm choosing to do it this way for right now just to make it easier to see how it works. If you want to declare your variables here and assign them at the same time, that's fine. If you're more comfortable with this, this is fine. For the time being, if you want to break it apart, it's okay. Now later in the semester, it'll be much more efficient code, and you'll have less lines of code if you just declare them at the same time. Alright, so I'm going to add the 2 numbers together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever the value is of dbl number 1 and dbl number 2 and put that into dbl sum. So dbl sum is equal to dbl number 1 plus dbl number 2. Okay, so that was easy enough. We did the calculation. So now we need to write it somewhere. Now when we did our console-based application, we would do a console.writeLine and write on the screen that the sum of the 2 values was something. Alright, so what we're going to do is the same kind of thing that we did before, except in this time what we're doing is instead of a console.write, we're going to set the text value for our label to whatever the string is that we want it to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that our, actually this is going to be output the answer to the label. And so I'm going to say LBL, remember we have our labels, or LBLs, and we had answer, so hey look, I can manipulate that one. LBL answer is, dot text is equal to, so what I'm doing is I'm looking at the LBL answer label and its text value, and I'm going to manipulate the text value. And the text value is simply going to be that I want to put the sum of the first number and the second number is equal to the answer. So what I'm going to put here is the same thing that I would have put inside of the parentheses for console.writeLine. So I'm going to say the sum of, and I'm going to use my substitution. So I'm going to say curly bracket 0 and curly bracket 1 is curly bracket 2. Okay. Well, what's going to go into those? Well, 0 is going to be dbl number 1. The second one is going to be dbl number 2. And the third thing is going to be dbl sum. Now what you'll notice is that we have the little underlines under this. It means that something's wrong. So the catch is that I have to somehow put all this text together. And for me to be able to do this, I'm going to use my string format function. So the same thing that we use to format things as money. Alright, so what I'm going to do is string.format, and then all of this is going to go inside of a set of parentheses. And what this will do for me is it will make it that when I display this out to the screen, it will format this entire thing, and it will put these numbers inside of my text string and substitute in for the 0, 1, and 2. Alright, so I want to see if the program works, so we're going to go ahead and start it. And our first number, we're going to put a 3, tabbed in the next box, 5, tab to calculate, and I can either press the space bar or I can click calculate, And when I click it, now I get the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. Now if you notice, it actually is over here a little bit to the left. I want to center it a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the program, go back to our form designer, and I need to find my label. Remember, it's hidden so I can't see it. And I'm just simply going to move it over a little bit. And the intention here is to make it look a little bit nicer. I'll show you more ways to do this later. But now I get something that's closer to centered. So this is the basic program. I'm just simply asking the user for input. I am taking their input. I'm converting it to a number. Once I convert both of these to a number, I add them together and put it into another number variable. Then we will simply replace the text, the label's text, with a formatted string, and the string is just simply going to be the same thing that we've been doing with the console.writeLine where we do our substitution. So now I get the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. That's our answer. It looks a lot more professional than just simply sticking 8 here, because what does 8 mean? This one actually explains what exactly are we trying to accomplish. Alright, so my program is working now just because I want to. I'm going to move my label over just a little bit more. And when I'm ready to run this, when I'm ready to actually save it, what I want to do is make sure this whole thing looks all nice and pretty. I want it to be presentable, something that you would actually show to somebody and say, hey, I could sell that. That's the way it should look. Alright, so when I make sure that this works, I know that my 3 and my 5 should equal up to 8, and it looks professional. This is what I want. Alright, so let me try a couple things that might break it. Alright, if I try to do something like 3.2 and 5.8, and we calculate this, now I get the values added together. Okay, so maybe let's try 5.7 so we end up with a decimal instead. There we go, now I have a decimal. So now they're all working. Because they're all doubles, it will allow for decimal points. I can do my same formats that I could do before, so if I wanted to always have 2 decimal places, I could do that kind of stuff. We can still do all of our casting. We can format it. Everything we've been able to do with the console app, we can do with the forms-based application. We just have the added requirement of making the form itself. Once you're sure that your program is working just fine, you're to run it. Make sure it runs because that builds your executable. And then you want to make a published version of it. You want to make it where somebody could actually take your program and install it. So you're going to go to Build, Publish. Wait for it to come up. We're going to put it in the Publish folder. Next, we're just simply going to select all the defaults because we're just going to install from a CD or something like that, or a flash drive. We're not going to check for updates. Finish, and it will create our installer package for us. Alright, so once it's done, it brings up the folder for us. This is our actual installer for it. Now we can give this to somebody else. They could just simply install it on their computer and they have a copy of our working application. When you're done, go back up to the projects folder, right click on your solutions folder. You're going to send to a compressed folder, and that's what you're actually going to submit for this project. Make sure you do this for each one of your projects. They all need to be zipped up so that way I can unzip them, and then they have your name on it, they have the actual week name or the page name, and then they have the problem number that's in the textbook. So this is what you're going to be doing for every program. You're going to design the GUI-based forms application. You're going to make sure it runs. You're going to publish it. You want to make sure it looks professional. Rename all of your elements. Make sure that everything works before you submit it. It has to work correctly to receive credit for it. So that's it. That's the basis for Visual Studio. Now we do have some other things that are in Studio that we will be using later. The big things that you need to know are going to be how to build a form, some troubleshooting things you can do, just like in some of our other programming languages. Those of you that have used Raptor before, you have the ability to step into programs. You can actually do that here in your program. So if you run a program and you get an error, you can actually debug it and step into it. And what that'll do is it'll run the code one line at a time, and you can watch what it's doing. So that's the basis of using Visual Studio. You're going to rebuild all of the same exercises that you did in the last chapter This time you're going to rebuild them using the IDE. You're going to build forms-based applications. So what I would strongly suggest is go back and look at your different code that you've created, how you did your formatting text, how you've asked the user for input, how you have manipulated the input, how you've used variables, and you're going to be doing the same kind of thing throughout this section.